Hey guys, welcome back to Ben & Brewing's channel. For those of you that haven't been here before, we do product reviews, tutorials, and we have an online chat feature to help you through your Brew Day 911s. You may notice my intro is a little different today than it normally is. It is summertime in Glendale, Arizona, and I didn't feel like going out into the 115-degree afternoon and dying. So we're doing our intro here in studio. Today's video is all about the FLOTit 2.0 by Homebrewer Labs. We're going to go through and compare it to some of the options that are out there, talk about some of the price differences, and is it really worth going through and purchasing something like this. We are going to put it through its paces and talk about how it compares to the other contenders that are out there on the market. As a reminder, we do have our YouTube store up and running. You should see links to some of our merchandise below. Please feel free to click on and buy a t-shirt or a mug if you'd like to support the channel. We also have a bigger store, more merchandise options on our website, benandbrewing.com. Let's get into it. All right, guys, as I mentioned earlier, we're doing a review of the FLOTit 2.0 today. But before we get into that, I did want to talk about what a floating dip tube is for those of you that are not familiar with it. Basically, it is a length of tubing, typically silicone, with a stainless steel float on one end. And basically what it does is you put it in your keg, and the float keeps the end of the tube at the top of the beer so that as you're draining out your keg, it slowly sinks to the bottom. What that does is it keeps you from getting all of the junk and stuff that can accumulate at the bottom of your kegs, especially if you have a little bit of yeast or trub or if you're carbonating in the kegs. So it's kind of an invaluable tool. The other reason people use it is for pressure fermentation. It's very, very handy when you're transferring from your primary fermentation in a keg into secondary. You're leaving all that trub and junk at the bottom of the keg behind and transferring over the clear beer into secondary, or if you're ready to keg it. So with the standard dip tube, which is very inexpensive to buy, there are some inherent problems with it, or some things that don't make it quite as perfect as it could be. Now, our friend from Homebrewer LAB, Trong, was kind enough to send us his version, the FLOTit 2.0, of a floating dip tube, and there's some changes that he's made specifically to it that really improve upon the design. As a quick reminder, as I mentioned before, Trong sent us the FLOTit 2.0 to do our review on it. He has not seen this video prior to posting, so our opinions are our own, and we really want to run it through its paces and see, is it really worth investing in that particular dip tube over the two other variants that are out there, because there is a little bit of a price increase. Let's take a closer look at the FLOTit 2.0. It is actually somewhat similar in design to the floating dip tubes that are out there, but there are a number of key differences. For one thing, the stainless stem that goes in to replace your existing stem for your outflow is longer than a standard one. The tubing, you'll notice, is actually a little bit thinner of a diameter, and there's a reason for that. And you'll notice that the float itself is all stainless. The float itself is a different shape. The way it connects to the mesh filters is different. And it actually has two stainless filters inside, and it actually makes it pretty easy to disassemble and clean. So the pricing on this currently, you can get it on Amazon, is $29, and that will be linked below. The difference with this is, compared to a standard floating dip tube, obviously, is it has a screen on it, a mesh screen. Now, you can get floating dip tubes that have a sort of a mesh screen on them, and they kind of have a plastic housing around the mesh itself. I like the fact this is all stainless, which is very nice. And typically you see those with the mesh, they're about 50 microns, so they've got a pretty big gap in the mesh itself. This one has two separate meshes at 300 and 500 microns, so if you take a closer look at it itself, I'm gonna go ahead and pull this apart real quick. Tubing comes off, here is your main filter. Float comes off, has these nice rubber gaskets, but you can see there is a bigger mesh here that blocks most of the stuff, and then a finer mesh in between that really, one, stops a lot of junk from coming through, and two, keeps it from clogging, which is actually a really, really cool design. The other thing, as I mentioned before, is the tubing itself. It is narrower than a regular dip tube, and there's a benefit with that when you're installing it into the keg. We'll cover that here in just a second. So we already looked at the FLOTit. Let's look at the other options that are out there on the market. And as I mentioned before, you've got your standard fare with your floating dip tube with a stainless ball, and it kind of works as designed, and it functions just great. The price for that, usually you can find it about $14, so that's gonna be your entry-level price point, and it serves its function, it does what it's supposed to do. There's another option that's upgraded above that, and I believe Kegland makes it, and I'm sure there's others out there that make it as well. This one does have a little mesh on the end, along with that same stainless floating dip tube. And the tubing is the same as well, the same grade of silicone. These will run you about $18, so you get a little bit of filtration with it. The only metal that's on here is the piece that goes into the keg and the stainless dip tube. This is still plastic, obviously the mesh is metal, but the housing for it itself is plastic, and from what I can tell, you can't open up and clean this out. So if you get stuff in there, you're not able to get it out. The final option, and this is the one that we tested extensively, is Trong. It is all stainless, medical grade silicone tubing, very easy to install, very easy to clean. This one does run a little bit more. This is about $29, but the design of it and the ability to completely take it apart to clean it and sanitize it, because it is all stainless, there's no way anything can get scratched in there, unlike a plastic housing, really give it a good benefit. So let's really see how these compare. Okay, so let's look at one of the benefits of the FLOTit 2.0. As I mentioned earlier, there's a difference in the diameter of the dip tube, of the silicone tubing itself. So let me show you on a standard dip tube to install, right? You have your keg, you have to unscrew the poppet, right? And then you're gonna pull out, maybe, I need to be taller. Let's see here. My poppets are real tight. Oh goodness. Okay, I'm gonna pull this down real quick. Whew. Okay, so you get your stainless dip tube out. We're gonna pull this guy. And then to install, you need to remove the rubber tubing from your insert that goes into the keg. And then you actually have to put this whole thing in and then reach your arm in to find the poppet, which is actually tricky to get on because the angle's weird anyway. But once you get it installed, it's really not too bad. Cleaning it, however, can be difficult. So let's look at how the FLOTit does by comparison. So the difference with the FLOTit is that instead of taking the tubing off of your stainless, you remove the tubing from the float. You insert the tubing with the stainless steel in. And then you don't really have to stick your arm in. Now you can reach in and grab the tubing, which is very easy to do. You really minimize the amount of contact of having your arm in the keg. For those who are a little squeamish about sticking your arm in there and grabbing it, Trong also makes, or Homebrew LAB also makes a kind of a grabby tool, so you can grab the tubing without having to stick your arm in there. So, there we go. So once that's done, you fish the tube out, you attach the filter, and you drop back in. And that's it. The install is way easier on this floating dip tube. So next, let's talk about the performance of the FLOTit dip tube to see if there truly is no beer left behind with this particular design. Now, with the other two versions that we mentioned before, as far as the design themselves, they both operate under the same principle, that floating float, stainless float. One obviously has a mesh screen to help prevent hops and things from getting through. The other one does not, but really the principle of them is exactly the same. So once they get to the bottom, at some point, those end pieces are going to be buried in whatever's at the bottom of your keg. What's unique about the FLOTit 2.0 is that the float itself actually isn't attached and floating up here. It is in line with the filter. And if you look at it, the inlet for it is actually in the float itself. So you end up with a floating device that as it gets to the bottom of the keg, it can get very close to the bottom of the keg before it actually encounters any sort of tube or things. And with the mesh screens and stuff like that, that actually helps with both of them in place to keep the tube from really getting through. So even once it hits the bottom, it is actually very efficient. That's the theory anyway. And I wanted to understand better really how it functions, so I wanted to put it to a test. So what we did is we brewed up a 10-gallon batch of beer. We were gonna do a pressure ferment on this batch. I believe it was a Helles Bock, which came out not too bad, but that's beside the point. We put a floating dip tube, the standard one in one keg, and we put the FLOTit 2.0 in the other. We let it go through its full fermentation. We used a classic spunding valve on the standard dip tube, and we used, actually, Homebrew Labs makes a really nice stainless spunding valve as well. That review will be coming. It's a bit of a price point, but man, that thing is beautiful. I digress. So we did the test on the 2. When we got done with fermentation, then we drained out all the clear beer after letting it settle and cold crashing it to make sure everything settled out. We let both kegs drain into secondary using their corresponding dip tubes. And it's interesting. Once we got to the bottom and you're initially looking inside the kegs, you're like, well, that's interesting. There's appears to be less trub that's less liquid, I should say, that's left over in the FLOTit 2.0, but it's kind of hard to tell looking at the bottom of the keg. I tried to get some shots of it, but it really wasn't a good indicator. So I said, well, let's pour it out and measure it. I mean, we pitched the yeast and we split the batch, so everything should have been equal from the amount of yeast in each batch to the amount of liquid in each batch, so everything was equal. How did it actually perform? Well, we poured the stuff out of the keg, the FLOTit 2.0, into this kind of measuring vessel, and I marked on there where it came up at the bottom of the keg. And as you can see, it was about 750 milliliters of trub that was really left over. And that was pretty much it. So I said, well, that seems pretty good. Let's try the other keg. We poured out the vessel, we dumped that keg into the measuring device again, and it actually wasn't big enough to hold all of the junk that was left in the bottom of the keg. There was a lot more liquid that you get mixed up in the trub as I poured it into the measuring container. So the container was actually overflowing. So once it hit way above what the first batch measured, I kind of gave up and was like, well, okay, clearly it works better. And what was amazing about it is it truly was just clear beer that was coming out of it. Now, as we get to the very bottom of it, we did get a little bit of trub, to be expected. With the other floating dip tube, we actually got quite a bit, and that's why I had to cut it off. Otherwise, I was going to get way too much junk into my secondary fermenters. All right, let's talk about dry hop performance with the FLOTit 2.0. Now, to be honest with you, when we did our pressure fermentation test in the keg, we did not dry hop it because it is a bit more tricky to do in a keg. And unfortunately, the recipe that I chose, in hindsight, would not have lent itself to dry hopping. So unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to really thoroughly test the dry hopping capabilities of this. Our plan is to see how many hops this thing, or how many ounces of hops this can could handle before clogging, if there was even a point at which it would. Because we weren't able to do it, we'd do some more research, and based on what we've seen kind of from other reviewers and things out there, it really doesn't clog. It does a great job of keeping the stuff out of there. But if you've watched our channel for any length of time, you know that we kind of like to test this stuff ourselves, and so there will be a future video where we will really stress test this thing and put it through its paces. But based on what we've heard so far with the dry hopping, it doesn't seem to be an issue at all. Let's go over some of the pros of the FLOTit 2.0. So first of all, it is all stainless with the exception of the silicone tubing, which is medical grade silicone tubing. So I'm sure that it's fine from a food standpoint, silicone, especially the food grade stuff that we're using in the other floating dip tubes. It's probably about the same. I think the only difference would be this is probably a little bit more durable since it is medical grade. It's got probably a higher tolerances than your standard silicone food grade tubing. The all stainless construction, like I mentioned, is absolutely amazing. Again, if you've watched the channel before, you know I love stainless, and so being able to really deep clean this thing and boil it if you need to without having to worry about it warping because it's not plastic is fantastic. The other thing that's great with it is that you can take it apart completely to clean it. So if you do get a little bit of junk in there between the two filters, or even inside of it, you can completely disassemble it, completely clean it, and then reassemble it. The other nice thing, which is a really kind of a cool design thing that really only an engineer would think of, it's such a detail, but being able to install it without having to take the whole thing apart or to jam your arm inside of the keg. For me, I kind of have longer wrists and longer fingers, so me making that 90-degree turn to get that tubing back up on the piece is a pain in the ass. So not having to do that is tremendously helpful. It makes it so much easier to take it in and out to clean it, or even just remove it from the tubing to disassemble to clean. So that's honestly, that in itself is a game changer. Finally, the other great thing that I love about the FLOTit is the fact that it does have two filter screens in it. The 300 and 500 micron. The outer one is a little bit larger, the inner one is a little bit smaller, so you get double filtration, dual filters in such a little tiny package. I am shocked that this hasn't been done before because it just makes so much sense. And it really is a game changer besides the keg changing, but this is really a game changer in keeping junk out of your beer as you're transferring or as you're just pouring off that first pint. So This FLOTit does come with a couple of cons. There's a couple things to keep in mind before you do invest in it. The first one is that once you do get it disassembled, and this is something that tripped me up a little bit, it's super easy to take apart. It pops right apart, you get nice and clean and sanitized and everything, you know, barkeeper's friend all scrubbed out, the stainless is shiny. And then you start putting it back together. It can be a little finicky to put together. The screens and the parts are small as they're designed, and so you do need to be gentle when you're reassembling the gaskets and things in there because you don't want to bend it. Now, that's not to say that this is a flimsy piece of equipment by any stretch, but you do have to be gentle and you do have to make sure that all the gaskets and things are seated correctly. It was really difficult the first time I tried to put it together. Once I figured out exactly how to kind of maneuver the gaskets and things, then it went on pretty easy and I had a good technique. So about the third time I reassembled it, I was really, really good at doing it. So just keep that in mind when you get it. It is a little bit difficult to put together. The other con with it, and this is probably honestly the biggest con of it, is that it is more expensive than the other options out there. I mean, at $29, is it the most expensive piece of brewing equipment you're gonna own in your brewery? Probably not. But it is $29 for this piece of kit. However, this thing is so well built that frankly, you'll probably pass it on to your grandchildren. And it is really well built. And frankly, in our opinion, is it worth the $29 to get it? I think so. There are so few cons. I only had two that I could come up with this piece of equipment. And there are so many benefits that come with it. Now, if you're buying it for multiple kegs, that is gonna add up pretty quickly. And to be honest, we're probably going to end up buying it for all of our kegs because it is such a big difference, especially with the pressure fermentation and being able to transfer clear beer from the get-go in our kegs. Final thoughts on the FLOTit 2.0 by Homebrewer Labs. We actually really like it. We don't usually promote stuff that we don't like, frankly. In the additional cost and things, I think is worth it, as I mentioned before, and it's definitely something that we're going to invest in and continue to put through its paces, and there'll be more videos to come on it as well as we really start to stress test it. Thank you so much for watching our video on the FLOTit 2.0. If you feel this brought you value, please hit the like and subscribe button. Feel free to share this video as well. It really helps with that YouTube algorithm, and it does mean a lot to us when you do that and tells us to continue to make you this wonderful content. Also, links to purchase the FLOTit 2.0 are linked below on Amazon. Those may or may not be affiliate links. They may just be regular links. Either way, that does help to support the channel. We also have our merch store up, if you've noticed, below our videos now. So feel free to buy a mug or a t-shirt to help support the channel. We have more merchandise available at our website, benhambrewing.com. Catch you later, my friends.